This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's Dispatches series. This is our first episode of the Dispatches series in this new year, and we start by looking back at 2020. We reflect on the farmers' protest, the ongoing arrests of political prisoners, and the Indian state's response to COVID 19. We look at the ongoing abuses of power, police impunity, crony capitalism, and analyze the various ways in which the authoritarian and fascist policies and politics are playing out in India from both an historical perspective, but always with a firm lens on the present. Our guests today are Professor Ravinder Kaur, and author Omair Ahmad. Professor Ravinder Kaur is an historian of contemporary India. She's an associate professor of modern South Asian studies at the University of Copenhagen. Her core research focuses on the process of capitalist transformation in 21st century India. This is a subject of a most recent book, The Brand New Nation, Capitalist Dreams and Nationalist Designs in 21st Century India. Omair Ahmad is the South Asia editor of The Third Pole, which reports on river basins of the Himalayan and the Central Asian regions. He's the author of The Kingdom at the Center of the World, Jimmy the Terrorist, and The Storyteller's Tale. Professor Ravinder Kaur and Omair Ahmad, thank you so much for joining us today. Ravinder, I want to start with you. In your book, in your most recent book, you've written and also you've spoken about the relationship between the neoliberal promises and how Hindutva politics work. I was wondering if you could kind of talk to us about this in relationship to the ongoing farmers' protests.
Well, I think I'll begin by saying that the current regime basically has two legs to stand on. And one is the question of free market economy, free market capitalism, and the other is the older project of Hindutva. So here, what is taking place is that during the pandemic, we see two things happening. That a number of steps have been taken and at a very accelerated pace. One set relates to the market reforms, and this is where the farm reforms come in. And it's not just farm laws, it is also labor laws together, which I think a lot of people have simply not paid attention to, that labor rights have also been weakened in this process. So farm laws, labor laws, put together, they open up a whole new condition for production and consumption in the Indian economy. The second leg, of course, is as I said, the older project of Hindutva. And here you see that what has been accelerated literally is the key symbolic issues which have been dear to the Hindutva project. For example, Ram Temple. I think a lot of people, I don't know if they paid attention to that. One of the first things Yogi Adityanath in UP did was and this is just when a very strict lockdown had been implemented, that he broke that lockdown and actually went to do a particular ritual. So I think it basically sort of, laid out that where the priorities lie and what simply cannot be put on hold, something which cannot be put aside. So I think these two legs of, Indian politics, and I think here I must also mention a paradox. The paradox is that Indian economy is not doing particularly well, and it hasn't done particularly well since 2016. And I'm saying this just to go back that, one of the electoral promises upon which the Modi government has succeeded once and twice in 2019, it has been on the slogan of Achhe Din, the good time. And as we all know that since 2016, Indian economy has been on a backslide. And the most recent estimates are that Indian economy is actually contracting. And of course, we are in a pandemic. But India is one of the economies which is not doing especially well. So, and the paradox is that economy is not doing very well, but BJP continues to be a dominant political power. And I think this is where, this whole notion of hope, as the fuel to Indian economy, it continues to run on hope So first, hope used to be that India is finally going to make it, and not just a nation in a collective sort of sense, but also people's personal aspirations of growth, of prosperity, of making it. But this time, I think we are in a spot where those promises have been, postponed in a way that they come without a deadline. So, for example, this whole notion of $5 trillion economy, which is very highly publicized, but nevertheless, this time has been put forward to 2024. Suchitra, you are muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I can't believe like we are 9 months into the pandemic and we're still learning mute and unmute. Apologies. Sorry, Ravinder, I have a follow-up question for you. Um, you talk about transformation of India, transforming India into the labor market for the world, this marketplace for the world. How do you see that in relationship with the new farm laws and then how the agriculture sector could be remade?
As I mentioned, it is not just farm laws which have happened, and it is put together with the labor laws. And basically, when we think about this old notion that India is to be remade into the factory of the world, which, by the way, is an idea which has shaped up more recently in China. That China is the manufacturing hub of the world, and during pandemic, as everyone knows, that given the wide critique there has been against China, much of that effort has been to displace the so-called supply lines to other countries or to take them back. So a lot of Asian countries especially have been competing to get some of those manufacturing opportunities, and this includes Vietnam, Bangladesh. I mean, all countries are doing that. So in India, this has been especially strengthened because Indian economy in shape and scale, I mean, it is pretty big, right? So I think the idea of factory of the world literally is that this is the place where you come and manufacture. And this basically means to become an attractive investment destination, means that you can offer natural resources, you can offer cheap labor, you can actually deregulate. And this is what is happening with the farms, that India already actually has very little protection for farmers. Actually, it is among the lowest in the world. European Union, USA, Canada, I mean, wherever you go, you would find there are some sort of protections and subsidies for the farm sector, which tends to be very, very risky and fragile. So India already is very low on that, but even that is being taken back, right? So being pulled apart. So I think it is the combination of, there's one more thing I must mention, that in India, the whole discourse of reforms works in a particular way, where reform basically means dismantling the state support. That does not necessarily mean that you're putting something into it. And this is very different from the ways in which economic structures actually work in different parts of the world. So I think this I find that somehow it feeds into these older notions of Indian conservative approach, where you believe that people must, and this has nothing to do with neoliberalism. These predate long before that, where you think that people who don't have enough, they are not meritorious enough, or they have not worked hard enough. So somehow, in a way, those kind of traditions have been plugged into this whole neoliberal discourse to produce a situation where deregulation or dismantling the state support in itself is seen enough a condition to stimulate production. You muted.
Again, oh Jesus, this is this is a very, I don't know, at this point in time it's becoming a metaphor for something. Omair, I'm coming to you. You spoke about the fact that how this is not just neoliberal politics, but there's also this role of crony capitalism that's kind of playing out. Can you walk us through that and tell us a little bit more about that?
So, and I want to actually point out to something Professor Kaur said, is that what does reform mean? When we're talking about economic reform, you're talking about a society that can produce goods, that can, at the same time, uplift its own population. Whatever our critiques of China, and I have many, its greatest claim to legitimacy has been that it has brought hundreds of millions of its own population out of poverty, and that has also been the uh, the uh, the foundation of the liberal politics in India post 1991, the economic liberalism. But there were a couple of things that were different between Chinese liberalization, so-called whatever, I mean, the economic liberalization project and India's liberalization project. Biggest thing about the Chinese economic liberalization project was it was a recovery, right? I mean, this was a recovery from the devastation that Mao, with his massively centralized, hugely destructive projects, had pushed upon China. And so it wasn't simply something new that was happening. It reconnected to much of the Chinese businessmen in the region. It reconnected to a past that was there, and a past that was backed by a bureaucracy, no matter how far it had fallen since then. In India's case, since 1991, and you have Chitambram writing about this, you're talking about jobless growth, right? So you had economic growth, but it was largely still within the hands of a very small sector of the economy. So you have 25, 50 million people out of a population of 1.3 billion doing well. All the malls, all the glitzy stuff is basically aimed at that population. That's a tiny population. And the rest of the population is reduced in one to being basically unskilled labor, not even skilled labor. And the problem with a lot of these laws that have been repealed, or there's whether they were repealed or not, is more for the more problematic part of it, and this is structurally there in all of the farm laws. It destroys the ability for the person to negotiate on an even manner with people with much greater money. And so, for example, the farm laws, among the clauses is, if there is a dispute, and for there to be a dispute, the farmer must have in written a document of his contract with the corporation, which is hard enough to get. But even if he has that, and if he wishes to have deal with this dispute, he or she, because actually the mass number of farm workers are women, although the owners are largely men. If a farmer wishes to dispute a problem with the sale, they are not allowed to approach the courts. A junior administrative officer, a subdivisional magistrate, has the power and the complete leeway to judge that matter. And an SDM has very little time and a huge amount of, therefore, ability to judge as they want. And do we really think they will judge on the side of a farmer versus a big corporation? I'm sorry, just there's no logical sense to it. So what you have is, and that's just the farm laws. You can look back through the support now of the Adani enterprises getting all of these private airports, or Reliance Jio basically getting favorable treatment in its licensing plans. All of these empower a set of very few actors against actually all market logic whatsoever. So you're getting the worst of all possible worlds. What you're getting is an oligarchy. And for the vast majority of people in India, what you're getting is a position where you cannot challenge anything of that oligarchy. And unlike China, you're not going to build people above and get them out of poverty on this basis. And I am a huge critic of China, but to be worse than China is really, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel here.
I have this question, the next question, I'm putting it to both of you. Do you believe then, do you see the hurried passing of the farm laws and a series of other things that have played out in the last few years as a part of a larger anti democratic project? Or how do you view the ways in which these laws have been pushed and passed?
Should I? So I think perhaps the way to think about this is the ways in which some of these laws have been passed in the cover, of the pandemic, and with minimal of discussion, which normally precedes such momentous kind of decisions. And I think the government has been saying that no, we have had these consultations have been going forever. But if we recall that this particular law, the farm law, was passed in the parliament with a voice vote, and there was huge amount of chaos, and no one really knew who was saying what. So to take such a huge decision in such a process, and that too when otherwise parliament has been, has not been called, that these kind of bills have been passed in such a hurried way. So I think, in a sense, all those democratic checks and balances, which have been the precedent, that they have been sort of like bypassed. So a new precedent has been set where you would say, well, this is in the national interest, and who should decide the national interest? It is the government. And of course, it has a lot to do with the ways in which our entire parliamentary democracy works, namely also with the anti-defection laws, that members of parliament, MLAs, that they no longer have that space to even discuss or to have a differing opinion than what has been told by the political party. So in a way, it's a whole different shape of parliamentary democracy which is shaping up. So I mean, a lot of people would say, well, it is not anti-democratic because it did take place in the parliament. But on the other hand, when you actually look at the process, it seems like that this is, democracy has never been about majoritarian voice. I mean, it depends on how you look at democracy. If it is merely a question of, elections and that kind of affirmation, then of course it's a democracy. But when you think about liberal rights, what kind of how do you exercise your rights? Then I think we are in a new kind of scenario where it's a very narrow view of what democratic condition ought to be.
I'm going to go one step further than Professor Kaur and say, actually, what you're seeing is the substance of democracy being hollowed out, while the facade of democracy remains. All of us have studied, these regimes like, say, Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime, and laughed at, the 95% people who voted for Saddam Hussein, right? Those are ridiculous numbers. And in the same way, because there was no substance behind, there was nothing. You can have these ballots, you can have all of this stuffing. There's no way that there is any legitimacy to the process itself. There's no way you can challenge the state and survive. And that is something that is happening increasingly in India, where you have the performance of democracy. So this bill is passed in parliament, but no discussion is allowed. And then parliament is shut down because of COVID. Well, you can have a Kumbh Mela. You can have blatantly illegal local assemblies being sworn into power. You can have all of these ridiculous parties and all of that, but you can't have parliament. You can't have a discussion in parliament. I mean, it is asinine. And it is, again, it's, and I've said this before to other people, that the Hindu Rashtra idea, well, the Hindu part of it you can leave at whatever basis you want. as you can of many Islamic regimes or other regimes of this sort. But the real question is, what's the rush? Where's the state? The state itself is being dismantled to such a degree that it has no meaning. The country dances to the tunes of a couple of people, and then you have a whole administration lining up to somehow implement this. But there's no discussion, there's no thinking, there's no real give and take. And without that, democracy breaks down. I mean, it does not really exist anymore.
Omair, kind of brings us to something that has been playing out, especially in relationship to the environment. What's happened, the cannibalistic ways in which the environment is being destroyed, the extractive policies. I want to discuss two things. First part of it, I want to really start with discussing the extractive, unsustainable economic policies that have been put into place in the last few years. And second part of it, I kind of want to discuss the larger environmental impact of what's kind of happened and played out in the last year. So can we start with the larger policies that have now causing larger environmental destructions?
Okay, I don't want to actually dump this on this government alone, because these are issues that have extended for a long period of time. For example, the displacement of tribal populations, of indigenous populations called the scheduled tribes under our constitution. They're supposed to be about 8% of our population, and they account for more than 40% of the people displaced by large hydro dams. And how can that be? So this is your poorest, most vulnerable populations. And the vast majority of them are being displaced by these dams. And then you look at the environment impact assessments in a lot of these dams. And whether it's Himachal Pradesh, whether it's J&K, whether it's Arunachal, many of these environment impact assessments are ridiculous. So you have villagers coming to very few of these hearings and say, I am from such and such place, and you're saying you have 90% approval, but we have never seen you people. So there's a set of complicated frauds that happen on the public, in which contractors get the license through people who are associated with them and provide the assessments. These people are not accountable to the people on the ground, because the people on the ground in areas where these large hydropower and other projects are being put in place are often themselves quite poor. They don't have the ability to lobby. They don't have the ability to influence either their state government or the national government. And you have promises of jobs, you have promises of this, but at the end of the day, what these large companies end up doing is importing very cheap labor from places that no longer are able to give jobs to people. So you have a bunch of people from Bihar ending up working in dams in Upper Himachal, right? And these are poor people set against poor people. And because these large contractors are given clearance, are backed by the state government, the police end up enforcing their writ. They don't enforce the writ of the state. They enforce the writ of contractors. So if there are protests, who ends up in jail? It's the local population. And then you have large numbers of these areas where local populations have to endure their houses being broken down. They're unable to get any compensation for this. The only hospital thing that they get are the ones that these corporations build, if they build. So first your crop goes, your buildings go, your health go, and the only recourse you have is from the people who are destroying your house and your life and your livelihood. And at the end of the day, the most idiotic thing is that these are not economically viable options. You have so many abandoned large hydropower projects across South Asia. And they only make sense because you get a huge chunk of money from the state to contractors. And then over time, they are just a drain on the exchequer. So what do we do with all of this? And a lot of this is just about the concentration of power and wealth in very few hands and complete impunity that brings with it. So I'll stop there.
Omair, I have a follow-up question. You were in India as the pandemic happened. You saw the great you have to explain that expression. I mean, as you respond. I want to talk about the environmental aspect of this as well. There is a way in which certain communities were policed, certain ways in which the migration happened. Talk to us about the ground realities of how things played out, especially post COVID.
Okay, so my reaction of it was basically that just the despair at the hugely bad communication strategy taken up by the government. I was actually in Nepal doing a journalist training exercise at the end of February, right? So when I came back to Delhi, just after the massive violence in Delhi at that time, we got a temperature check and that was it, right? That was the extent. Nobody took down an address. If I was coming in with the virus, nobody would have even known how to trace me, right? And anyway, the virus took 14 days to gestate. All of these things, there was no protocol. None of us were, again, cautioned about these things. Then, forget the nonsense media that you get, but there was no clear, coherent strategy adopted by the center and the states about what was going to happen. So you go down the road wearing your mask to the vegetable vendor, and he's saying, "Yeah, this is all nonsense, and this is this will go away." And you try to explain, "Look, this is a problem. The infection will have this much impact. But look, I'm a nobody. What you needed was the governments to actually talk straight about the problems." And then suddenly you have this idiotic idea of 4 hours before everything must shut down. And of course, forget the thali banging and everything else that went into it. Let's leave that aside. But okay, in 4 hours, everything needs to shut down. Now, when everything needs to shut down in 4 hours, everybody rushes to get supplies because they don't know, because there's no communication of when things will reopen. So by design, almost, you end up forcing everybody into tight situations because they only have 4 hours to pick up food. And they don't know when they're going to get that food, access to that food again. So that was one major disaster. After that, there was no communication about how things will open up for day upon day upon day upon day, until what happened is that people who were dependent on daily labor, which is a huge number of people, finally ended up just walking home because they were caught between this fear that things would not come to normal, that somehow they would end up in hospital. And one day's hospitalization in any of the private hospitals was equivalent to more than 1 lakh, which would be 100,000 rupees, which would be, let's say, $1,500, right? The average per capita annual income in India is about $2,000. So one day's hospitalization for most of these people who wouldn't be at 50% would be more than a year's expense. I mean, they were dead people either way. So they chose to do that walk. In the middle of all of this, of course, the idiot government decides that they have to blame the Tablighi Jamaat for everything, right? And So you have this complete circus of TV channels and the governments trying to blame everything on one organization which had one meeting in Delhi. And subsequent court cases have finally said or shown that they did nothing wrong. But you ended up not taking responsibility for anything. Nobody knew what to do in case of a problem. You didn't know when a lockdown would open. You didn't know when it would close. And the people who were impacted the most of this were, of course, the people on the margins, right? So this is daily labor. This is scheduled tribes and Dalit communities, the ones who are always getting the thick end of the stick by the state, right? Because they desperately needed their wages. So you need to go and get it. On top of that were the frontline workers, the ASHA workers, who are often paid as little as 2,000 rupees a month for their labor. And 2,000 rupees a month is what? It's how many dollars? It's $15? No, a little more than that. Sorry. It's about $25 to $30, right? The frontline workers were pushed to basically get all the readouts, to do all of that, and they had neither mass nor ability to secure themselves. So at the end of the day, what you had is the very rich retreating onto themselves, which are again only a 25 million to a 50 million population, and the vast majority of the very poor just left with no knowledge about what's happening. They had an imaginary villain, the Tablighi Jamaat, to blame, and they had no way to get good medical advice. And I still don't know why we have managed to survive, but I'm thankful we have. But it was almost designed to be the most cruel to the most vulnerable.
Omair, thank you for laying that out. We now have a series of audience questions coming in. I know that I definitely want to talk about the political prisoners, but I think there are a series of questions that are coming out about the farmers' protest, and I'm going to put it to both of you. The first one talks about do you see any prospect of turning the farmers' protest to a more sustained political influence through parties and legislature? So I was wondering, and then of course the second set of questions are all about the Supreme Court of India. So perhaps we start with looking at the farmers' protest as, is there a possibility for this protest to become something more? Ravinder, perhaps you can start with you.
I think I have to say that I've been hearing this quite a bit. Like there are lots of expectations out of this farmers' protests. And sometimes I think it is being unfair to the protesters because there are way too many, a lot has been put on their head actually. What I'm trying to say is, having taken part in many different debates, this is one thing which continues to come up again and again. And these people are sitting there for a particular set of laws, right? And they have been very consistent that they do not want any political parties attached to them, right? And whether you can debate whether it's a good strategy or a bad strategy, but I think it would be almost unfair to expect that they should do the job of political parties. Because political parties in India, and by that I mean, people speak about Congress party, but that's not the only party, which is the non-BJP party. There are many other parties, right? So they are basically riding on the wave, but without doing that organization, mobilization, which is happening in a completely organic way. And the ways in which it is being sustained, a political protest could not be sustained like this. And what I'm trying to say is that, of course, there are lots of, farmers' unions also, which are not from Punjab and Haryana. They are also involved in this. But the basic cultural traditions which are carrying through these protests or sustaining them, they actually derive from Punjab in many ways. And by that, what I mean is, that, for example, this whole notion of seva, service, that is sustaining it. There is no political party or organization which is doing all that kind of organization, which is actually nitty-gritty of what to do when you have thousands of people collected at one point. Who's going to feed them? Who's going to, from the very basics. So I think I've been very taken by that, how this cultural politics, the kind of cultural politics which is, sustaining this. And perhaps we should not expect them to play the role of political parties and let political parties also take up some of the burden.
Omair, you want to come in?
Yeah, I completely agree with Professor Kaur. These protesters are protesting about these specific laws, and that is what it's about for them. And you can talk about these laws as indicative of a loss of federalism, as an indicative of a loss of parliamentary democracy, and as indicative of the fact that you need to have a long-term idea of how agriculture needs to reform within India. You can talk about all of that, but that's not the job of these particular protesters. These protesters are basically saying that these three laws are ones that will destroy our livelihood and our future, and we do not want them. The minute that that is taken on board, if and when these laws are rolled back, their role largely ends, and you cannot force them to save the country. That's not what they are actually there for a very simple, straightforward reason, and that's okay. I do think other actors need to come up. I do think other parties need to figure out a way to talk about all of these things together. That this particular law is symbolic also of the NRC CAA decisions. It's also symbolic of the way that our water resources are being managed. It's also symbolic of how our federalism is being destroyed. It's also symbolic of how Kashmir is being handled, right? And to stitch that together and get back to the idea that India has always had a problem with its federalism. It's never really figured that out. It's always treated its marginalized like, let's say, unparliamentary language inserted here. Other people need to do that. I know people who are doing that. I've talked to people who are doing that. There are both retired civil servants as well as military officers, as well as other civil society activists who've been talking about this. But it needs to be a political movement, and it needs to be broad-based. But that's not what these guys will do. And to force this challenge upon them is unfair.
We have another question. This is about the Supreme Court. We have a couple of questions about the Supreme Court of India. One is asking if Supreme Court of India is now become an extension of the state. Someone says, I would rather say on Hindutva lines. And there are a bunch of other comments that have come in that again talk about the role of Supreme Court in diluting the current protests at the moment. What is your responses to both of it? Ravinder, do you want to go first?
Well, I think there is a lot of debate going on about the relationship between the executive and the judiciary, and it's an older debate. And thus far, that judiciary should be independent. There has been a lot of effort, and in many ways, the structures make it. As you know, there was this effort to create this National Judicial, Council. I'm just forgetting the full name, where the appointments of the judges would be made by a panel, governmental panel. And
National Judicial Accountability Commission.
And then that was actually, battled out. And so thus far, that is there. But in some ways, maybe the problem is that, for example, the last CJI, Chief Justice of India, and he has actually sort of entered, politics. And that kind of this whole thing that, there is something at the end of your tenure, whether you become, some kind of governmental position, that sort of opens up the system to, some sort of exploitation. So I think in that sense, there are questions being raised. And of course, it would be terrible if, in a country like India, which prides on its democratic traditions, that judiciary does not, like maintain its independence. And if you contrast with America, there actually, many of the institutions, despite having this very bitter Democratic Republican divide, I mean, the institutions still hold. And I think that kind of, legitimacy is tremendously important. And I think, recently the judgment, this order given by the Supreme Court to make this committee, this panel, there's hardly anyone who really believes in it. I mean, they made this 4-persons committee, and there's one member today or yesterday, he even has withdrawn from it. I mean, that's quite a big thing when one of the appointed members says, no, I don't want to take part in this because there are problems, and the farmers, they are not ready to appear before it. So I think there is strong need. I don't know who should do the rethink, but surely it is upon the court to be doing this.
And that I kind of want to now move to discussing about political dissent, the arrest of dissident and dissident voices, the arrest of BK. Now we have BK16. I was wondering how both of you saw the year 2020 in relationship to dissent, but also what was happening to activists across the board. Omair, would you like to take this one?
Okay, well, in terms of dissent, the Bhima Karegaon case is actually at the center of how the state decided it was going to go after everybody. So from Sudha Bhardwaj onwards. And or you could actually even go back to the time of the JNU protests and the beating of the Students' Union members in the center, in the podium of the Delhi High Court by BJP-linked lawyers, while the police looked on. And immediately thereafter, the head of the police for Delhi was appointed to the Union Public Service Commission, right, as one of his things. So there was a step-by-step move on how dissent was going to be dealt with. You were going to have violence with the state standing by and allowing that violence to happen. So basically, mob violence was okayed and rewarded. The police officers who took part in it were given choice plum assignments thereafter. Then the ridiculous cases put against people like Sudha Bhardwaj and the rest, where the process has been made the punishment. Right, so you can be put in jail for 2 years. I think it's now been 2 years for Sudha, less for the others. But without the Supreme Court or any of the courts actually doing anything about it, and all of these things, to be honest, have been presaged in other areas. I mean, Kashmir has seen this for years with the Public Safety Act, which basically allowed anybody to be put in jail from the 70s onwards, right, for 2 years with no charges, with no evidence, right? Oh, well, there was the charge. You were disrupting public safety, but you didn't need to provide any evidence as long. And so these, the destruction of democracy while keeping the facade of it on had already been, this had already been done earlier, and has now been brought into the mainstream. And so all of these people, none of these charges have been proved. None of them have been even allowed their time in the courts. And you can stop somebody, an 85-year-old man with Alzheimer's, not give him a sippy cup. You can take away Gautam Navlaka's glasses. It's the whole thing is to is to clearly say it doesn't matter if you follow the law. It doesn't matter how clean your hands are. It doesn't matter how prominent you are. We can crush you and nobody can save you. I wonder now whether that will change. A lot of this was facilitated by the grifter regime of Trump. I wonder if that will change. I hope that it will. I don't think it'll change massively, but I have a few little hopes.
Ravinder, do you want to come in? What were your thoughts of looking at 2020 in relationship to dissident voices, ongoing persecution of resistance?
I think by now we have simply become used to this term called anti-national, which probably doesn't exist anywhere else. So there's somebody actually had to ask me, what does it even mean? I wrote in an article, it's like, okay, this is a very specific form of political category which has been created in India, which basically means that on one hand, I will bring you back to this whole question that India, as this enclosure of capital, this place where growth is generated, it continuously demands that we speak positively of the nation to enhance its value in the world, both economic and cultural value. But at the same time, India also pitches itself as a democratic nation. It is part of its, self-identity. This is how, world's largest democracy. But democracy inherently demands dissent. It inherently demands that we speak about things which may not be, part of the consensus or something, where you breach the code, so to say. So these are two things which are inherently at odds with each other. The question of dissent, which makes a democracy, and at the same time that you package the nation as an enclosure, which is solely driven towards economic growth, a place of growth generation. So I think this kind of contradiction has created this whole category called anti-national, which has become part of our vocabulary. And that is actually from 2019. And more and more, people continue to be added to it. I mean, like farmers, workers, they were the most recent entrants, because before, it began with JNU students or, intellectuals, and who gives, who cares, for that category of people? They can be easily dismissed. But here, I think larger and larger groups are being put into that category. And I think at some point, it loses meaning altogether.
There are a few questions coming in. One about, I'm just going to flash one, but they're all kind of going to the question of accountability within the regime, the accountability of the Prime Minister of India. My question is, why has there been an incapacity to hold those responsible for this series of crises, misuse of power, accountable? Why is there a struggle to hold the Prime Minister of India accountable for a series of political and policy failures?
Okay, this time I'll go first. And I'll say the answer is very simple. You have a media space dominated completely and utterly by lapdogs, by a servile, mad propagandist network of people who are, if there is a word for anti-national, this is our biggest problem. India has been completely betrayed by the fourth estate, and the media in India has been at the forefront of destroying the legitimacy of the opposition, of any dissent, and packaging lies upon lies upon lies. This is the 7th year you have a prime minister who's afraid of taking a press conference. It's just ridiculous. In any decent country, any decent media would have said this is unacceptable. But what you have is a media which falls over itself to salivate at the latest offering of these rank idiots, talking about becoming, pulling oxygen out of the air through wind-powered turbines, right? I mean, the embarrassment one feels to have a prime minister this stupid is hard to exaggerate. But unfortunately, what you have is a whole system that falls over backwards to deny that we're ruled by a bunch of ignorant criminals. And that makes it impossible for any kind of association, whether it's civil society or opposition, to find any space, because they'll say, there is no alternative. Because no alternative is at all allowed any kind of public hearing. And that's a huge factor. Propaganda is a massive factor in how this government is run. And you can again link this to the oligarchy that is being created. You look at the ownership patterns of all of these large TV houses, and this is TV that's running most of this. And the TV houses that are running all of this, and who are also the ones who are benefiting directly from the services of the government. And I mean, only today you've had the Maharashtra police release and leak the notes of Arnab Goswami, and how he's saying how he has benefited the government, how the government should benefit him. So you have a very clear mesh between mass media in India and the government, with a very few actors benefiting.
Ravinder, would you like to come in? Do you want to respond? Ravinder, can you hear us?
No, I'm sorry.
No, I wanted to know if you wanted to respond to the question about holding the Prime Minister and others accountable. Why the lack of accountability, or why we are unable to hold them accountable?
I think there are two things. Which one thing is that the whole system has become increasingly, in practice, presidential form, even though it's a parliamentary democracy, which has a completely different kind of systems involved, and where there is one single individual who becomes the key person, right? And added to that, of course, is this whole, which I have begun to think in terms of, this rule by spectacle. The spectacle is such a huge part of governance that sometimes it almost, displaces the actual, low-key bureaucratic governance, the way we are used to. The way we think about bureaucracy, all those functions, like boring as they may be, and lackluster as they might be, but they form the backbone of how administrations are run. But here, the spectacle has almost overshadowed, or sometimes even replaced. And I think pandemic was literally an exercise in witnessing this form of governance, which actually has become so deeply entrenched in India in the last 6 years. And I think, as we have mentioned already, I think there have been 2 or 3 instances where the Prime Minister announces that I'm going to address the nation at 8 o'clock. And there have been jokes, like people get literally afraid. What is going to come now? I think, if I remember correctly, I think it started with demonetization announcement in 2016. And at 12 o'clock, all the rupee notes, 500 and thousands were gone. And people were running to banks, but it did create an impact. That is what the spectacle is all about. And like the citizens were participating in this huge performance by, they had a role in this theater too by standing in front of the banks. And similarly, I think during the pandemic, of course, we had this whole very well orchestrated, I simply can't remember now. There was something about like making like at this hour and these minutes that you should come and collect, and then you should perform these rituals. And people were literally doing it almost like cheerfully and obediently, So this kind of, governance by spectacle, I think has, and I think Omair mentioned that, Mr. Modi also has this unique, history where he has actually not taken a press conference, which is so amazing for the world's largest democracy, that the elected leaders would not appear for a press conference, and it is almost unheard of, which basically means that this entire publicity is managed as a one-way street, and democracy does demand that you do have a dialogue, and it is not just me listening to the radio Man Ki Baat, but me asking questions too, which are completely unorchestrated and which may even be uncomfortable.
We're actually closer to our 1 hour mark. And we have a lot of questions coming in that we might not be able to take because we're running out of time. But what I do want to do is kind of go back to something that you wrote in 2019, Ravinder. In 2019, you wrote in the Express about the superstitious belief in the existence of a very unchanging India, how secularism is somehow a part of our DNA. But in reality, democracy needs far more work. I would love to hear both of you think about this nature of this, that perhaps India's DNA is not secularism. Maybe that is not the case. But also kind of include a question from an audience member saying, do you see a broader uprising among the Indians? Is there resistance possible? I know they are tall, large, grand questions, but I would love to kind of hear your concluding remarks from both of you. Ravinder, would you like to go first?
Yes, I mean, I think you mentioned this little piece that I wrote in 2019, and it did receive some sort of, feedback. And the point that I made was that we have all grown up with, what is simply called the idea of India. Now it's a famous book published in 1995, but it is also it has also become something which has become part of the public discourse. There are TV debates held on the idea of India, and each time something happens which people say, well, it's a setback to the idea of India. Now the thing is, it has become, I think, a complacency had set in that this is who we are. And this is how, of course, collective identities are formed too. There's nothing wrong in it to think that, well, we are inherently democratic and secular people, right? Now, the problem is that people also forgot that democracy is also a question of practice. It is not in our DNA. It is something that we have inculcated, something we have practiced, something which we have forged over and over again over several decades. And just at that, this ethos, this self-identity can be built, it can also be undone. So I think the way I would say is that to think about the idea of India, which is a laudable idea, to think about India as a democratic and secular nation, a pluralistic, multicultural place where regardless of who you are, you can find a space. And, many of us want to hold on to that idea. But I think we must also remember it's an aspiration. It's a post-colonial aspiration, which is born out of a very, very long anti-colonial struggle. And to simply take it as something which is inherent is doing a disservice. The moment we think about is as a project, as an aspirational project, which continues to demand work, then I think the picture would look different.
So let me add to that. And I wholeheartedly agree with Professor Kaur saying that, nothing's in our DNA. I remember talking to a German friend a diplomat, and he was saying how comfortable the idea of the end of history was for Germans who had been burnt by, the thing of a leader, of so much so that the word for leader, Führer, can no longer be used in German language easily, or at least not legitimately. So there is a comfort. Every country has these delusions that they are somehow beautiful by their very nature. Right? Every people, every country has this delusion. It's okay to have such a delusion because it's nice to think well of ourselves, but it can easily become complacency. I think it's interesting for a lot of white Americans to have seen a Buffalo Bikini Man in the middle of the Capitol and realize how seriously messed up parts of America are. A lot of African Americans knew it already and had experienced it and told people this, but people had not listened. Uh, Similarly, I mean, the rot in this idea was there a long time ago. And you could say that with whether it's Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, where he said, "We have not got our full freedom." You can look at it between the argument between Ambedkar and Gandhi, where both are talking about that things right now cannot continue as they are. And Gandhi talks about the village federation, and Ambedkar says, the village is a sinkhole of prejudice. And both things are true because the urban did not provide an escape, neither did the rural. The aspiration to have a fair chance has always been there and will always exist. So, in that sense, what I would suggest is there's always a chance, there's always an opportunity. That the aspiration for freedom and for democracy, for a fair chance, which is at the essence of what we're talking about, the idea of justice, does not die despite a huge architecture of injustice being put upon people. And freedom, liberty, democracy, fraternity, all of these values are only one if we fight for them. They are not in isolation.
Omair, is that fight possible? Do you think
Yes.
it is one of the questions?
Yes, I think the fight is possible. It is always possible. I won't just say that it's possible. I say that it is necessary for it to become possible. Unless we fight, the fight is impossible. If that makes sense.
Omair, Ahmad, Professor Ravinder, Kaur, thank you so much for joining us today. If you've heard, listened, or read any of the work from Polis Project, please consider donating to us. Today's segment was produced by Vaishali Patra, Sadhana Sindhilkumar, and Anika Singh. And as usual, thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.